All right, so this is really just to get something off my chest because there are so many creative people out there like me who are constantly fighting this internal battle because of a lie that they heard at church. Growing up in church, I felt a lot of guilt for writing pop music and wanting to write pop music for a living. I was told that writing secular music was not a way, a legitimate way, for a Christian to use their gifts. And I thought that that was just kind of an old way of thinking and that people had moved on from that conversation. But just the other day, I saw an article where this famous gospel artist was posing in a photograph with a famous rap artist, and underneath that article were all of those crazy, mean, judgmental comments. He faced so much criticism for simply taking a picture with someone who doesn't make gospel music. And so it seems like that thought process is alive and well, and it's really surprising among Christians because if you start talking to someone, they start telling you a story. They say once upon a time, or they start speaking and they say roses are red, violets are blue. You know exactly from the way that they begin speaking what kind of language they're using. You know they're telling a fairy tale or they're reciting a poem, and you know how to listen to that. You know how to interpret it. And you know what to do with that kind of speech. Well, the people who heard that familiar story in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the first audience, they knew that as they listened to this story of God going through this 6 phase process of creating the world or planting a garden in Eden, that they were listening to the story of someone building a temple. And so that story in Genesis about creation, we want to make it about, how old the earth is and all that kind of stuff, but it's not a scientific treatise. It's telling us a spiritual truth about the world, and that spiritual truth about the world is that God created this place that we live as a temple, which implies at least two things, right? Temples are, first off, places where gods intend to live. And so if God creates this world as a temple, that means that it is a place that God intends to live, and therefore, number two, that this place is sacred. This place with its dirt and birds and trees and mountains and all of this is deeply meaningful to God. And and that's the reason why when he creates it, he says it is very good. Then he creates people and puts them in there. And the thing that's interesting about this is that, okay, so God creates this sacred space, puts people in it, and wants them to live appropriately in that sacred space. But living appropriately in that sacred space, what he wants for them to do is not build churches and make Bibles and start religions and all that kind of stuff. He's the first thing he tells them to do is to be fruitful and multiply. Basically, have sex. He tells them to enjoy all of the fruit in the garden. Basically, all of these things that we consider just being very ordinary, everyday, mundane things about being human, eating and drinking and relating to one another and starting relationships with one another, all of that is somehow the sacred vocation that he gives to human beings. Just to be, just to live. And I think about this, I've been thinking about this for years. Why did God do this? Right now, where I land is that if you take that story seriously, then it seems that God created the world and people because he wanted to be present to human life. He wanted to be present to the human experience and all that it means, and in the falling in love and the relating to one another and the eating and the drinking and the finding pleasure and working and having meaningful work in the world, that God wanted to be present to all of that. Somebody needs to say it, because if you think about it that way, then the natural flow of what it means to be a person of faith, what it means to be a Christian, would be that we would live our normal lives and we just learn to do them well. Not all of this obsession with rule keeping and with appearing to be a religious person. It would just be about being a person and being good at being a person. And I say this because, I look at these interviews with some of the more popular artists who have gone from making gospel music to making R&B music or soul music, and When they're asked, they say things like, well, there's a glass ceiling in gospel music and you can't get past it, or I wanted to do something bigger. Listen, I'm not criticizing those answers, but I sit on the edge of my seat sometimes just waiting for someone to lean forward and say, there really is no choice to be made here. Like, my faith does not demand that I only write songs about God, but the whole thing about my faith is that God felt that it was good for me to be human and to be here, and that God wants to be present to that experience, and that God wants to celebrate that experience with me and wants to affirm that experience and even help me to be successful in that experience of being human. There there is no choice here. There's no choice between sacred and secular, because in God's eyes, there is no secular world. What I'm doing is sacred. It is the logical conclusion of everything that I believe about God and about the world. I wish that more people knew about this, and I can't for the life of me figure out why in the world have I spent my entire life around the church and I've never once heard a sermon on what I just told you. The first couple chapters in the Bible they convey this whole vision of living in this world and enjoying this life and experiencing all that it has to offer as a divine gift and embracing it all as something sacred. And yet, there's hardly a Christian that I know that has ever heard that message. What's the deal with that?